The small room was cold and quiet. Gray walls surrounded a metal table where two beings sat across from each other. One was human. The other was not. Dr. Elena Vasquez looked at the creature sitting across from her. Kethavar Thornscale had once been a mighty warrior. Now he was broken. Where he should have had 4 strong arms, only one remained. The other 3 were gone, leaving twisted scars across his dark green skin. His face bore deep cuts that had healed badly. One of his yellow eyes was cloudy and blind. "Thank you for agreeing to this interview," Elena said softly. She placed a small recording device on the table between them. "The Galactic Peace Archives want to understand what happened during the war. Your story matters." Kethavar stared at the device for a long moment. His remaining hand shook slightly. 20 years, he whispered. 20 years since the war ended, and still I see their faces in my dreams. Elena waited. She had learned that pushing too hard made alien veterans shut down completely. Kethavar was the 7th Zephyrian soldier she had interviewed. The others had all refused to talk about fighting humans directly. They would discuss battles against other species, but when she mentioned human combat, they would fall silent. "My people are proud warriors," Kethavar finally said. His voice was rough, like gravel scraping against stone. "For 3,000 years we have conquered world after world. 17 star systems bow to the Zephyrian Empire. We know how to fight. We know how to win." He looked up at Elena with his good eye. "We thought we knew everything about war." Elena nodded encouragingly. "Tell me about first contact with humans." Kethavar's mouth twisted into what might have been a smile, but there was no joy in it. "Your ships were small, weak-looking. Our sensors showed you had basic weapons and simple armor. Our military analysts laughed when they saw the reports." He paused, his hand clenching into a fist on the table. "They called you soft meat. That was the term they used in briefings. The humans are soft meat, easy to cut, quick to break." Elena felt a chill run down her spine, but she kept her expression neutral. "What did your commanders tell you about the upcoming campaign?" "Standard conquest protocol," Kethavar replied. "Overwhelming force demonstration. Destroy a few military targets. Show superior technology. Most species surrender after seeing what we can do. Those that don't break after the first real battle." He was quiet for a moment, staring at his scarred hand. "The War Council estimated 3 weeks for complete human surrender. Maybe 4 if you were particularly stubborn." "But that's not what happened," Elena said gently. Kethavar's good eye fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "No, that is not what happened at all." He began to speak more quickly now, as if the words were poison he needed to get out of his system. "We followed standard procedure. Orbital bombardment of your military bases on Kepler Prime. Direct strike on your command centers. Your fleet was scattered and broken within hours." Elena had read the reports. The opening attack had been devastating. Humanity had lost 60% of its military assets in the first day. "Your survivors sent a message to our fleet commander," Kethavar continued. "We expected a surrender offer. Terms for peaceful occupation. What did they send instead?" Kethavar was quiet for so long that Elena thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "A song." Elena blinked. "A song?" "An old human song. Something about falling down and getting back up. Our translators worked on it for hours. They thought it might be some kind of code." He laughed, but the sound held no humor. "It was not a code. It was a promise." Elena leaned forward slightly. "What happened next?" "Ground assault on Kepler Prime, standard procedure. Land troops, secure strategic points, accept surrender of remaining forces." Kethavar's voice grew distant, as if he was seeing something far away. "I was part of the 3rd wave. By the time we landed, the first 2 waves had already secured the landing zones." He stopped talking and stared at the wall behind Elena. "Kethavar?" she prompted gently. "The humans were waiting for us," he said. "Not in their broken bases or damaged bunkers. They were everywhere. In the trees. Underground. Some had climbed inside the wreckage of their own ships and waited." Elena could see his hand trembling now. The tough warrior was reliving something that still terrified him decades later. "They should have been broken," he continued. "Defeated, demoralized, that is how war works. You show superior force, the enemy loses hope. But humans didn't lose hope." Kethavar looked directly at her again. "Dr. Vasquez, have you ever seen a human soldier smile while bleeding to death?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Elena felt her mouth go dry. "No, I have. Many times. Too many times, Kethvar closed his eyes. The first one I saw was during the battle for Communications Hill. A human female. She had been shot through the chest. The wound was clearly fatal. She was propped against a rock, blood covering her uniform. He opened his eyes and looked at Elena with an expression she couldn't quite read. She was still shooting at us, and she was smiling. Elena waited, knowing there was more. When we finally reached her position, she was dead, but in her other hand was a grenade with the pin pulled. She had been holding the safety lever down, waiting. Kethvar shuddered. My squad leader reached for her weapon. The moment he moved her arm, the grenade exploded. How many casualties? Elena asked, though part of her didn't want to know. 3 dead. 2 wounded, from one dying human who refused to simply die. Elena made a note on her tablet, trying to keep her expression professional, but inside she felt a strange mix of pride and horror. That was just the beginning, Kethvar said. The reports started coming in from all over the battlefield. Humans fighting with broken bones. Humans using their own blood to mark targets for artillery strikes. Humans who kept fighting even after losing limbs. He was breathing harder now, as if the memories were stealing his air. One of your soldiers lost both legs to an explosive blast. Instead of calling for medical aid, he dragged himself toward our position using his hands. He had improvised explosive devices strapped to his chest. Elena felt sick. Did he detonate? Yes, took out an entire squad of my people. Kethvar looked at his remaining hand. That was when I first began to understand. You humans do not fight to win. You fight to make sure your enemy loses. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the recording device. What did your commanders say about these reports? Helena finally asked. At first they thought we were exaggerating. No species fights like that. It goes against all survival instincts. Kethavar's voice was getting stronger, as if talking about it was helping somehow. But then the reports kept coming. From every front, every battle. He leaned forward, his good eye intense. Dr. Vasquez, in 3,000 years of conquest, we had never encountered a species that treated certain death as an acceptable tactical option. We did not know how to fight an enemy that was not afraid to die. Elena realized she had been holding her breath.
How did that change your approach?
Kethavar was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was filled with something that might have been respect. We tried to adapt, changed our tactics, used longer-range weapons, kept our distance. He shook his head slowly. It did not matter. Somehow you humans always found a way to get close enough to hurt us. The recording device continued its quiet humming, as both beings sat in the growing darkness of the small room. Kethvar closed his good eye and took a deep breath. When he opened it again, Elena could see he was no longer in the small interview room. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that still haunted him after 20 years. Proxima Station, he said quietly. That was where I first truly understood what we were fighting. Elena adjusted the recording device and waited. She had learned that interrupting these memories often caused the veterans to lose their train of thought entirely. It was supposed to be simple, Kethvar continued. Proxima Station was a human research facility. 43 humans total. Scientists, technicians, a few security guards. We sent 200 warriors. He flexed his remaining hand, watching the scars stretch across his knuckles. Standard assault protocol. Surround the station. Demand surrender. If they refuse, take it by force and capture survivors for questioning. Elena made notes while he spoke, but most of her attention was focused on his face. The old warrior's expression was troubled, as if he was still trying to understand something. That made no sense. The station commander was a human female named Captain Sarah Chen. She responded to our surrender demand within minutes. Kethvar paused. She said no, just no? Not just no. She sent a message that our translators had trouble with. She said her people would give us hell. We did not understand the expression at first. Kethvar stood up suddenly and walked to the small window. Outside, the alien moon's surface stretched away into darkness. We learned what it meant soon enough. Elena waited while he gathered his thoughts. Many veterans needed time to process difficult memories. The assault began at dawn, he said, still looking out the window. Perfect coordination. Overwhelming firepower. We breached the outer hull in 12 locations simultaneously. My squad entered through the medical bay. He turned back to face Elena, and she could see the confusion still present in his expression after all these years. The humans were waiting for us, but they were not hiding behind cover or setting up defensive positions. Kethvar shook his head slowly. They were standing in the open, and they were smiling. Elena felt that same chill from earlier return. Smiling? Dr. Chen stood in the center of the medical bay with her hands empty. No weapon, no armor, just her medical uniform and that smile. Kethvar sat back down heavily. She looked directly at me and said, "Welcome to Proxima Station. I hope you enjoy your stay." What happened next? Kethavar's remaining hand clenched into a fist. Everything went wrong. Not wrong like equipment failure or tactical errors. Wrong like the laws of reality had suddenly changed. He was speaking faster now, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. The humans had turned their entire station into a weapon. The medical equipment had been rigged to explode. The food synthesizers had been modified to produce toxic gas. Even the life support systems had been weaponized. Elena's stylus moved quickly across her tablet. How many casualties in the initial breach? 47 of my people died in the first 5 minutes. Not from weapons fire, from their own environment turning against them. Kethvar's voice was filled with an emotion Elena couldn't quite identify, but that was just the beginning. He stood up again and began pacing around the small room. Elena realized he couldn't sit still when discussing these particular memories. Dr. Chen continued treating wounded humans while explosions were going off around her. My squad leader ordered me to shoot her. I raised my weapon. Kethvar stopped pacing and looked directly at Elena. She looked at me and smiled wider. Did you shoot her? I tried to. My weapon malfunctioned. Later, we discovered the humans had somehow infected our targeting systems with a virus. Half our weapons would not fire when aimed at human targets. Elena made another note. Human cyber warfare capabilities had been greatly underestimated during the early war period. But the malfunctioning weapons were not the worst part. Kethvar continued. The worst part was watching how the humans fought when they had nothing left to lose. He sat back down and stared at his scarred hand. There was a human security guard named Martinez. A plasma bolt had severed his left arm completely. He should have been in shock. Should have been dying. What did he do instead? He picked up his severed arm and used it to beat one of my squad mates unconscious. Kethvar's voice was barely a whisper. Then he improvised a tourniquet from his belt and kept fighting. Elena found herself writing faster, trying to capture every detail. These accounts were unlike anything in the official military records. The battle lasted 6 hours, Kethvar said. 6 hours to secure a station that should have fallen in 30 minutes. And we never did capture it completely. What do you mean? The humans destroyed it rather than let us have it. Dr. Chen activated the station's reactor overload sequence, but she did not do it immediately. Kethavar's good eye was distant again. She waited until most of my people were inside. Elena felt her stomach turn. How many survived? 12. Out of 200. Kethvar was quiet for a long moment. But before the station was destroyed, something happened that I still do not understand. Elena looked up from her tablet. What? Dr. Chen found me in the wreckage. I was trapped under a collapsed bulkhead. My legs were crushed. I was dying. Kethvar's voice became even quieter. She could have left me there. Should have left me there. Instead, she used her medical equipment to stabilize my injuries. She saved your life? She saved my life so that I could tell this story. Kethvar met Elena's eyes. Before the reactor exploded, she leaned down close to me and said something I will never forget. Elena waited. Her stylus poised over the tablet, she said. When you go home, tell your people what happened here. Tell them that humans do not surrender. Tell them that we will turn every victory into a defeat. Tell them that we are coming. The room was silent except for the humming of the recording device. That was when I first understood. Kethvar continued. This was not a war in any sense my people comprehended. This was something else entirely. Elena looked at her notes, trying to process what she was hearing.
How did the other battles go?
Kethvar laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Worse, each battle was worse than the last. The humans were learning, adapting, getting better at being impossible to defeat. He stood up again and walked back to the window. The worst part was not their tactics or their weapons. The worst part was their eyes. Their eyes. Human eyes when they have decided to die for something. I have seen those eyes in my nightmares for 20 years. Kethavar's reflection stared back at him from the dark window. They were not the eyes of desperate creatures fighting for survival. They were the eyes of beings who had chosen their fate and were at peace with it. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. What happened after Proxima Station? Command changed our tactics. Longer-range bombardments, no more close assault unless absolutely necessary. Kethvar turned away from the window. It did not matter. Somehow the humans always found a way to get close enough to hurt us. He sat back down at the table and looked at the recording device. Dr. Vasquez, may I ask you a question? Elena nodded. How does a species learn to smile while dying? What kind of evolution produces beings who become more dangerous as they become more desperate? Elena realized she didn't have an answer. She had studied human psychology for years, but she had never thought about it from this perspective. I do not know, she said honestly. Kethvar nodded, as if he had expected that response. Neither did we, and that ignorance cost us everything. Elena refilled her water glass and checked the recording device. They had been talking for over 2 hours, and Kethvar showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, he seemed more eager to continue as the conversation progressed. After Proxima Station, my superiors thought they understood the problem, Kethvar said. He had returned to his seat but remained tense as if ready to flee at any moment. They believed humans were simply more willing to die than other species. The solution seemed obvious. What was their solution? Keep our distance. Use long-range bombardment. Avoid close combat entirely. Kethvar's mouth twisted into that joyless smile again. They thought they were being clever. Elena waited for him to continue. The Battle of Tau City 3 was our first attempt at the new strategy. Orbital bombardment for 3 days straight. Complete destruction of all major human settlements. Only then did we send down troops to secure the planet. Kethvar stood up and began pacing again. Elena noticed he always did this when the memories became particularly difficult. What we found on the surface made no sense according to any military doctrine we knew, he continued. The humans had not tried to hide from the bombardment. They had used it. Used it how? They had positioned themselves so that our own weapons would create the terrain they wanted. Craters became defensive positions. Destroyed buildings became sniper nests. They had turned our bombardment into a construction project. Elena made notes while trying to imagine the level of planning and courage such a strategy would require. But that was just the beginning, Kethvar said. The humans had developed new tactics, things we had never seen in 3,000 years of warfare. He stopped pacing and looked directly at Elena. Have you ever heard of something called the Phoenix Protocol? Elena shook her head. Human commanders would deliberately allow their positions to be overrun. They would fight just hard enough to make us commit significant forces, then retreat to secondary positions. Kethvar's good eye was wide with remembered disbelief. We thought we were winning. What actually happened? Massive explosions. The humans had planted explosives throughout their abandoned positions, but they waited until our forces were celebrating victory before detonating them. Kethvar sat back down heavily. They sacrificed their own bases to destroy our troops. Elena felt that familiar chill. The Phoenix Protocol had never been mentioned in any of the official human military records she had read. How many times did this happen? 17 confirmed instances. Probably more that we never discovered. Kethvar was staring at his scarred hand again. Each time we lost hundreds of warriors. Each time the humans seemed to anticipate exactly how we would respond. Elena looked up from her tablet. How did your commanders react? Panic. That is not a word you often hear applied to Zephyrian military leadership, but that is what it was. Kethvar's voice became bitter. For the first time in our history, we were fighting an enemy that became more dangerous when defeated. He was quiet for a moment, lost in memory. Tell me about the psychological warfare, Elena prompted gently. Kethvar's entire body shuddered. That was the worst part. The humans did not just fight our bodies. They fought our minds. How? Music, he whispered. They would broadcast music during battles. Not war songs or intimidating chants. Happy music. Cheerful music. Sometimes they would sing along while they were shooting at us. Elena felt her eyebrows rise. Singing during combat? There was a human squad that held a communication relay for 8 hours against overwhelming odds. We could hear them over the radio the entire time. They were taking casualties, running out of ammunition, and they were singing something called Don't Worry, Be Happy. Kethvar stood up again and walked to the far wall. Do you understand how deeply disturbing it is to fight an enemy that treats death as entertainment? Elena was beginning to understand why so many Zephyrian veterans refused to discuss their experiences with humans. They would leave messages for us, Kethvar continued. Graffiti on the walls of captured ships. Notes in our own language. Not threats or warnings, jokes. Jokes? A human soldier once left a note on my commanding officer's personal quarters. It said, "We borrowed some of your food. Thanks for dinner. Your new human friends." They had eaten our emergency rations and left human candy bars as payment. Elena found herself almost smiling, despite the grim nature of the conversation. "How did your commander react?" "He ordered the entire ship sterilized and refused to eat anything for 3 days." Kethvar's expression was troubled, but the psychological impact went deeper than simple pranks. He returned to his seat and leaned forward. The humans had a practice that our military psychologists could not explain. They hummed during combat. While under fire, while dying, they would hum simple melodies. Kethvar's voice became very quiet. There is something deeply unsettling about hearing a human hum a children's song while they are bleeding out from multiple wounds. Elena made careful notes, trying to capture not just the facts, but the emotional impact these tactics had clearly had. The worst battle for psychological warfare was Haven's Gate, Kethvar said. A single human battalion against 3 of our regiments. They had no supplies, no reinforcements, and no hope of victory. What happened? They held us off for 6 days. Kethvar's good eye was distant again. 6 days without food, water, or medical supplies. By the end, they were using our own dead as building materials for defensive positions. Elena felt her stomach turn. They used Zephyrian bodies as fortifications, stacked them like sandbags. But that was not the disturbing part. Kethvar shook his head slowly. The disturbing part was that they apologized to each corpse before moving it. They would say, "Sorry about this, friend. Hope you understand." The room fell silent except for the humming of the recording device. Even stranger was their treatment of wounded Zephyrian prisoners. Kethvar continued. They would share their limited medical supplies with enemy soldiers, treat our wounds before their own. One human medic died because she used her own blood plasma to save a Zephyrian warrior who had been trying to kill her minutes earlier. Elena looked up from her notes. Why would they do that? We asked the same question. The human medic's last words were recorded by one of our soldiers. She said, "Because it's the right thing to do." Kethvar's voice was filled with confusion even after 20 years. She died to save an enemy who would have killed her without hesitation. Elena realized she was holding her breath again. That was when our military psychologists began to understand the true scope of the problem. Kethvar said, "We were not fighting a normal species. We were fighting a species that had somehow separated their survival instincts from their moral choices." "What do you mean?" "Normal beings, when faced with death, will do anything to survive. Lie, cheat, abandon their principles, betray their allies. Survival comes first." Kethvar met Elena's eyes. "Humans do the opposite. The closer they come to death, the more strongly they hold to their principles." Elena felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. "How did that affect your troops?" "Our soldiers began to break down, not from physical wounds, but from psychological ones." Kethvar's voice became heavy. They could not understand how to fight an enemy that became more dangerous when defeated, more principled when desperate, and more united when separated. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the recording device. Command began rotating troops more frequently. He finally said, "Veteran soldiers who had fought humans were developing what your people would call trauma. But it was not trauma from being hurt. It was trauma from being unable to comprehend their enemies." Elena made another note. This was information that had never appeared in any official records. "The final psychological weapon was the most effective," Kethvar said quietly. "Human mercy. Mercy?" When they captured Zephyrian soldiers, they did not execute them or torture them for information. They treated them well, fed them, gave them medical care, let them send messages home to their families. Kethvar's remaining hand was trembling again. "Do you understand how that affected our troops? To be treated with kindness by an enemy they had been ordered to exterminate." Elena was beginning to understand the depth of the psychological warfare that had been conducted, perhaps without humans even realizing they were doing it. "Many of our captured soldiers refused to be exchanged," Kethvar said. "They wanted to stay with their human captors rather than return to the war." "How many?" "Nearly half. By the end of the war, we had more Zephyrian soldiers requesting asylum with humans than we had active combat troops." Elena stared at her notes, trying to process the implications of what she was hearing. That was when I began to suspect that we could not win this war, Kethvar said quietly, not because we lacked firepower or technology, but because we did not understand what we were fighting against. Elena noticed that Kethvar had grown very still. His remaining hand lay flat on the table, and his good eye stared at something she could not see. She recognized the signs from other interviews. He was approaching the memory that had broken him. New Geneva, he said softly. That was where I lost 3 of my arms. That was where I learned the final truth about humans. Elena waited, her stylus poised over the tablet. She had read the official reports about New Geneva. It was listed as the turning point of the war, but the details were classified at the highest levels. The siege lasted 4 months, Kethvar said. We had surrounded the human colony world's capital city. 2 million humans trapped inside. No way in or out. No supply lines. No hope of rescue. He finally looked up at Elena, and she could see the pain in his expression was still fresh after 20 years. Our strategy was simple. Cut off all resources and wait for surrender. Standard siege doctrine. Most cities surrender within 2 weeks when faced with starvation. But New Geneva didn't surrender. New Geneva became something else entirely. Kethvar's voice was filled with an emotion Elena couldn't identify. The humans turned their entire city into a single massive weapon. Every building, every street, every citizen. Elena felt her hand tighten around her stylus. What do you mean, every citizen? Children as young as 8 years old were carrying messages between resistance cells. Elderly humans who could barely walk were manufacturing explosives in their apartments. Pregnant women were volunteering for suicide missions. Kethvar stood up and walked to the window again. Elena was beginning to understand that he needed to look away when the memories became too intense. We had never encountered anything like it. In every other siege, there was a clear distinction between soldiers and civilians. In New Geneva, every human was a potential combatant. Elena made notes while trying to imagine the implications of total civilian involvement in warfare. The first indication of what we faced came on day 12 of the siege, Kethvar continued. We intercepted a transmission from the city. A 10-year-old human girl was giving tactical advice to a squad of adult soldiers. A child was involved in military planning. Not just involved, leading. Kethvar's reflection stared back at him from the dark window. The transmission was clear. She was coordinating attacks on 3 different fronts simultaneously, and she was doing it while attending what humans call school. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. By week 3, we realized the humans had turned the entire urban infrastructure into a weapon system, Kethvar said. The subway tunnels had been flooded to create underwater attack routes. Office buildings had been converted into sniper nests. Even the city's waste management system had been weaponized. How do you weaponize waste management? They used the sewage pipes to move explosives and personnel undetected. But more disturbing was their use of the city's children as intelligence assets. Kethvar turned away from the window and looked directly at Elena. Human. Children had learned to hack our communication systems. 8-year-olds were feeding false information to our command structure. They were treating it like a game. Elena realized she was holding her breath again. What kind of false information? Troop movements, supply locations, attack plans. Kethvar's good eye was wide with remembered disbelief. Our entire tactical advantage disappeared because human children were better at electronic warfare than our trained specialists. He sat back down at the table, but Elena could see he was struggling to remain still. The most disturbing discovery came in week 6, he said quietly. We captured a human resistance fighter who was badly wounded. During interrogation, we learned something that changed everything. Elena waited. The humans were using their own wounded as bait. Elena felt her stomach drop. What do you mean? They would allow certain injured humans to be captured, knowing we would take them to our medical facilities for treatment and interrogation. Kethvar's voice became very quiet. But these humans carried hidden tracking devices and communication equipment. They were spies, worse than spies. They were saboteurs who had volunteered to be tortured for information, while secretly gathering intelligence on our operations. Kethvar's remaining hand clenched into a fist. The human we captured had been feeding us false information for 2 weeks while we thought we were interrogating her. Elena made rapid notes, trying to capture the tactical implications of using wounded personnel as intelligence assets. That was when my unit was assigned to assault the city's central hospital. Kethvar continued. Command believed it would be a soft target. Medical personnel are traditionally non-combatants. Elena looked up from her tablet. But human medical personnel were combatants? The hospital had been converted into a fortress. But not just any fortress. Kethvar's voice grew distant again. The humans had created a medical fortress. They continued treating patients while under siege. Operating rooms were functioning during artillery bombardments. How was that possible? The patients were also fighters. Humans recovering from surgery would man defensive positions between medical procedures. Kethvar shook his head slowly. We watched through scopes as a human woman gave birth during a firefight. The medical staff delivered the baby while bullets were flying. Overhead, Elena felt tears forming in her eyes despite her attempts to maintain professional detachment. The assault began at dawn, Kethvar said. My squad breached the hospital's main entrance. We expected to find frightened medical staff and helpless patients. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his scarred hand. What did you find instead? Elena prompted gently. A human grandmother in a wheelchair manning a heavy machine gun. Kethvar's voice was barely a whisper. She was at least 80 years old, connected to medical equipment that was keeping her alive, and she was laying down covering fire for human soldiers half her age. Elena realized she was crying now, but she continued taking notes. When we finally reached her position, she was out of ammunition, but she was still smiling. Kethvar looked up at Elena with an expression of complete confusion. She looked at me and said, "You boys are late for visiting hours." What happened to her? She activated an explosive device hidden in her wheelchair. Took out my entire squad except for me. Kethvar's voice was hollow. I was thrown through a window into the hospital's pediatric ward. Elena's stylus stopped moving across the tablet. The children's ward had been evacuated, but it was not empty. Kethvar continued. Human children were using it as a base of operations. But they were not just hiding there. What were they doing? They had turned the playground equipment into weapons. Swings had been converted into catapults. Slides had been modified to launch projectiles. The monkey bars had been electrified. Kethvar stood up again and began pacing rapidly around the small room. But the most disturbing sight was the children themselves. They were still playing. Even while conducting military operations, they were still acting like children. Elena looked up from her notes. Playing how? They had a tea party set up in the corner of the ward. Stuffed animals seated around a small table with toy cups and plates. Kethvar's voice cracked slightly, and they invited me to join them. The room fell completely silent except for the humming of the recording device. A human girl, maybe 6 years old, walked up to where I was lying wounded and asked if I wanted tea and cookies. Kethvar's good eye was bright with unshed tears. She was holding a plasma grenade in one hand and a stuffed rabbit in the other. Elena realized she had stopped breathing. I tried to reach for my weapon, but she just shook her head and sat down next to me. She started bandaging my wounds with strips torn from her dress. Kethvar's voice became very quiet. She told me her name was Lucy. She asked if I had children at home. What did you tell her? The truth, that I had 3 offspring back on Zephyr Prime. Kethvar was crying now, tears streaming down his scarred face. She said she was sorry I was so far from home. She said her daddy was far away too, fighting bad people. Elena felt her own tears flowing freely now. That was when the building started to collapse. A direct hit from our artillery. Kethvar's voice was barely audible. Lucy could have run. Should have run. Instead, she threw herself over my body to protect me from the falling debris. Did she survive? Kethvar was quiet for so long that Elena thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was broken. No, she died saving the life of an enemy soldier. A 6-year-old human child gave her life to protect someone who had come to kill her people. The recording device continued its quiet humming as both beings sat in the darkness, overwhelmed by the weight of the story. That was when I understood, Kethvar finally said. We were not fighting a military force. We were fighting an entire species that had collectively decided that some things were more important than survival. Elena realized her hands were shaking as she tried to continue taking notes. How did you escape the building collapse? Human rescue workers pulled me out. They treated my injuries and had me transported to a prisoner exchange point. Kethvar wiped his eyes with his remaining hand. Even after losing 3 limbs, Even after watching their children die, they showed me mercy. Elena looked at her notes, trying to process the emotional impact of what she had just heard. Elena handed Kethvar a tissue and waited while he composed himself. The interview had been going on for nearly 4 hours, and she could see the emotional toll it was taking on the old warrior. But she sensed they were approaching something important, something that would explain why the mighty Zephyrian Empire had ultimately sued for peace. "Take your time," she said gently. "We can stop here if you need to rest." Kethvar shook his head and dabbed at his eyes with the tissue. "No, this story needs to be finished. The galaxy needs to understand what really happened." Elena checked the recording device and settled back in her chair. "What happened after New Geneva?" "Everything changed," Kethvar said. His voice was steadier now, as if telling the story of little Lucy had somehow helped him process the trauma, not just military tactics or strategic planning. The fundamental nature of Zephyrian society began to shift. How so? Soldiers returning from human conflicts were different, broken in ways we had never seen before. Kethvar looked directly at Elena. Physical wounds heal, but these warriors had been wounded in their understanding of reality itself. Elena made notes while Kethvar gathered his thoughts. For 3,000 years, Zephyrian military doctrine was based on simple principles. Superior force leads to quick victory. Defeated enemies surrender. Civilians flee or submit. These principles had never failed us. But humans violated all of those principles. Humans did not just violate them. Humans proved they were fundamentally wrong. Kethvar's good eye was intense. We discovered that our entire worldview was based on assumptions that were not universal truths. Elena leaned forward slightly. "What assumptions?" "That survival is the highest priority. That rational beings will choose life over principle. That there are limits to what people will sacrifice for abstract concepts like freedom or dignity." Kethvar stood up and walked to the far wall, where he stood with his back to Elena. The first crack in our society appeared 6 months after New Geneva. A transport ship full of Zephyrian veterans refused orders to deploy to another human world. Elena's stylus paused over her tablet. "They mutinied." "Not exactly. They simply said they would not fight humans anymore." Kethvar's voice was distant. When asked why, the squad leader said something that shocked the entire command structure. "What did he say?" "He said that humans had taught him something his own people never had. That there were things worth dying for and therefore things not worth killing for." Elena felt that familiar chill run down her spine. Within weeks, similar incidents began occurring throughout the fleet. Veterans refusing deployment. Active soldiers requesting transfers away from human conflicts. Some warriors simply laid down their weapons and walked away. Kethvar turned around to face Elena again. "The High Command tried everything. Court-martials, executions, psychological reconditioning. Nothing worked." What was causing this breakdown in military discipline? The veterans had seen something that changed them forever. They had seen a species that became stronger through suffering, more united through adversity, and more principled when faced with death. Kethvar sat back down at the table, but Elena could see he was still agitated. The worst part was not the military breakdown. The worst part was what happened when these veterans went home to their families. Elena waited for him to continue. They began to question everything about Zephyrian society. Why did we conquer other worlds? What gave us the right to impose our will on other species? How were we different from the tyrants we claimed to oppose? These were questions that had never been asked before. Never, for 3,000 years, might made right. Victory justified any action. The strong ruled the weak. Kethvar's voice became bitter. But humans had shown us something different. They had shown us that strength without principle was just bullying. Elena made rapid notes, trying to capture not just the military implications but the societal ones. 6 months later, the first peace protest began on Zephyr Prime. Kethvar continued. Veterans and their families demanding an end to the human war. Not because we were losing, but because they had decided it was wrong. How did the government respond? Panic, complete panic. Kethvar's expression was grim. The High Command had defeated 17 different species, but they had no idea how to handle their own people questioning the morality of conquest. He was quiet for a moment, staring at his remaining hand. That was when they made their final mistake. They decided to show the population what humans were really like. They broadcast footage from the human conflicts. expecting it to restore support for the war. Elena looked up from her tablet. What happened instead? The opposite of what they intended. When Zephyrians saw humans treating enemy wounded, protecting children and showing mercy to captured soldiers, public opinion shifted completely. Kethavar's voice became very quiet. There were riots, not demanding victory but demanding peace. Zephyrian citizens were ashamed of their own military for the first time in our history. Elena realized she was witnessing the account of not just a military defeat, but the collapse of an entire civilization's worldview. The final blow came from an unexpected source, Kethavar said. A recorded message from human prisoners of war. What kind of message? The prisoners sent a statement to their Zephyrian captors, but it was not what anyone expected. Kethavar met Elena's eyes. They thanked us for treating them well. They said they understood that individual Zephyrian soldiers were not responsible for the decisions of their leaders. Elena felt her eyebrows rise. Human prisoners were defending their captors? More than that, they were expressing sympathy for Zephyrian soldiers who had been forced into a war they did not understand. Kethavar's voice cracked slightly. They said they hoped that someday, both species could learn to live in peace. The room fell silent except for the humming of the recording device. How did the Zephyrian public react to this message? Mass demonstrations demanding immediate peace negotiations. Military units began refusing orders en masse. Several planetary governors declared independence from the Empire. Kethavar stood up and walked back to the window, staring out at the alien landscape. The High Command realized they had lost something more important than the war. They had lost the support of their own people. Elena made careful notes while processing the implications of what she was hearing. The peace negotiations began 8 months after New Geneva. Kethavar continued. But even then, the humans surprised us. How? Their terms were more generous than anything we would have offered a defeated enemy. They asked for reparations for damaged colonies, but they also offered humanitarian aid to war refugees on both sides. Kethavar turned away from the window and looked directly at Elena. Dr. Vasquez, your people offered to help rebuild Zephyrian worlds that had been damaged during the war. You offered medical aid to our wounded veterans. You offered to share agricultural technology to help feed our population. Elena felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. Why do you think humans made such generous offers? Because they understood something we did not. That lasting peace requires healing, not just victory. Kethavar's voice was filled with an emotion Elena couldn't quite identify. They knew that crushing an enemy completely only creates future conflicts. He sat back down at the table and stared at the recording device for a long moment. That is why I agreed to this interview, he said quietly. 20 years later, I am still trying to understand what happened. How a species we thought we understood completely taught us that we understood nothing at all. Elena realized they were approaching the end of the interview, but she sensed there was something more Kethavar needed to say. Is there anything else you want to add to the record? Kethavar was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with something that might have been wonder. There is one more thing, something I have never told anyone. Elena waited. During the final battle on New Geneva, after the building collapsed after little Lucy died saving my life, I was unconscious for several hours. He paused, as if gathering courage to continue. When I woke up, there was a human soldier sitting beside me. She was badly wounded, probably dying, but she was keeping watch to make sure I was safe. Elena felt tears forming in her eyes again. I asked her why she was protecting an enemy, why she was risking her own life for someone who had come to kill her people. Kethavar's good eye was bright with tears again. She looked at me and said 5 words that have haunted me for 20 years. Elena waited. Her stylus poised over the tablet, she said, because you are someone's child. The room fell completely silent. Elena realized she was holding her breath. That human soldier died an hour later, but before she died, she used her own medical supplies to treat my wounds. She gave me water from her own emergency rations. She told me about her family back on Earth. Kethavar wiped his eyes with his remaining hand. Dr. Vasquez, how does a species learn to see enemies as individuals worthy of compassion? How do you maintain your humanity while fighting for your survival? Elena realized she was crying openly now. I don't know, she whispered. That is the question that has consumed me for 20 years, Kethavar said. How do humans choose to be better than their circumstances allow? How do you find the strength to show mercy when mercy seems impossible?